Mr. Mayor, we are live.
All right, great. Thank you. So today is January 20th, 2021, and it is 5:12, and we are calling to order the Baldwin Park special meeting. At this point, I believe it's city clerk, Clerk Morales, can you do roll call, please?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Daniel Damian.
Here.
Councilmember Monica Garcia.
Here.
Councilmember Paul Hernandez.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Alejandra Avila.
Here.
And Mayor Emmanuel Estrada.
Here. And now we move on to public communications. Do we have anybody looking to speak today?
No, Mayor.
Great. So at this moment, I move to close public communications. And I believe at this point, we can open up our open study session regarding eviction law status update. And it's presented by our Director of Community Development, Ben Martinez.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, trying to log on. I'm ready to go. Okay. All right. Thank you, Honorable Mayor and City Council. Ben Martinez, Community Development Director. We are going to go through about a 10 to 15-minute presentation regarding status of eviction laws and rent control laws in the city of Baldwin Park and beyond. I'm going to provide introductory remarks, and then I'm going to pass the presentation over to our special assistant legal counsel from Robert Tafoya's office, Mr. Anthony Willoughby, and he will continue the presentation, and then we'll have time at the end for any questions or remarks. Thank you. So, just needless to say, the city has been involved in the issue of rent control and evictions even before COVID began in the early part of last year. We actually passed our rent control ordinance in the latter part of 2019 in November and December. So it's been about 1 year. The city staff has adjusted in working with these issues, servicing the public as best we can. We've serviced well over 400 plus inquiries that come through our hotline, through email or telephone call or referrals and so forth. We have registered well over 1,000 units for our registry program for the rental control ordinance. We've collected over $35,000 in fees because all the owners need to register with the city if they are a controlled unit, meaning all units in the city except for single families and duplexes. We assist households that experience rent increases that are in violation of our ordinance, or evictions. If need be, we do refer households and families to the Housing Rights Center. And in some cases, we are dealing with some cases where our legal counsel, Mr. Anthony Willoughby and Robert Tafoya, are assisting us with potential, we have to start looking at potential prosecutions for those landlords that are not following essentially the laws. And so we're beginning to look at those situations. We have about half a dozen, and we will be returning to the city council to get further discussion on some of those types of items in the near future. So I'm going to, it's been a busy year, I will say, in addition to the normal workload in the housing staff. This has been something very new to the city of Baldwin Park. As we know, cities like Pasadena and Santa Monica are well-versed, have staff, and have done this for many years. For a city like Baldwin Park, this is something new, but I think overall it's been a good year. We certainly have done a lot of outreach, including 3 notices to landlords. That a lot of them are understanding now what the rules are. So it's getting better and better. I think a program like this takes at least a year or so for people to really understand, what the lay of the land, and it is changing. So I'm going to pass over the presentation to our legal counsel, Anthony Willoughby, and he's going to go through the rest of the PowerPoint in relation to, again, local laws, state laws, federal, and some of the potential things that could be happening later this month that could impact how we move forward. Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Mayor, may I introduce Mr. Willoughby, just give you a short background about him?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Willoughby is an associate in my office, and he's been working very closely with Ben and the Community Development Department, especially in the rent control ordinance, other landlord issues related to the rent control ordinance. Does a number of things for Baldwin Park, but specializes a lot in the Community and Development Department thus far. So thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and please, Mr. Willoughby, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Tafoya, and good afternoon, Honorable Mayor and City Council. So I'm going to attempt to provide you some information about the state of the rent laws. It's a very complicated area, but I hope to give you some backgrounds. That way you have information available to you going forward. The first thing I want to address is sort of the overview of the statewide rent laws in California. There are really 2 big items: the Housing Act and AB 1482, which is a tenant-focused act. For the Housing Act, it establishes the baseline, and that is sort of everything that we do as far as rental laws comes out of this. It was passed in 1995. It controls everything has to do with where rent control can apply, what local governments can do. But the general purpose was to allow landlords the ability to raise rents during vacancies. To move forward, there were some more recent changes, and that is AB 1482. It's on the following slide. That really addressed just cause eviction, and it applied statewide. It also capped rent increases and provided tenants with the ability to prevent landlords from forcing them to waive their rights in their lease agreements. Now, there are some exceptions that apply to 1482. It on a rolling basis of 15 years. So it only applies from today, the past 15 years, meaning tomorrow, the dates move forward. The units are restricted. Affordable housing and other similar ones have their own provisions outside of 1482. And owner-occupied duplexes and privately owned single-family homes are also exempted from 1482. The key takeaways in all of this are that landlords have a basic right to establish their rental rates, and there is no commercial rent control statewide. Local governments need to be careful about crafting legislation so that landlords aren't forced to keep their properties on the rental market when they want to remove them. It does create the just cause evictions and the rent caps. The county created their own rent control laws and essentially divided the property into 2 separate things: fully covered and partially covered. Fully covered gets 2 protections, partially only gets the just cause protections. The big key takeaway here is, for all intents and purposes, it applies to dwelling units that are in unincorporated areas of Los Angeles County. There There are a couple of exceptions, but since we have passed our own ordinance, that would not apply to us. In our own ordinance, which is 1447, we followed the Housing Act and 1482 and applied those within our city and added some additional protections. We have a few major exceptions, mobile homes, duplexes, and things like that. But we did follow 1482, as you can see, with lease contracts not being able to waive the protections for tenants. We established rent increase. The rent increase starts with a base level and then is 3% during any 12-month period. The additional protection for landlords that we offered is we allowed them to raise 1%, whereas the statewide ordinance could actually prevent them from raising rent at all. Landlords do have some duties that apply to their tenants. They have to post and notify them of the maximum rent. They have their registration fees they need to pay, but we do allow them to petition for additional increases, and landlords can petition to pass through some improvement costs to their tenants. We also have a just cause eviction provision. This was sort of to bring us in line with 1482 and the rights secured by 1482. We have slight differences, but for the most part, we are in line with the state. In addition, we have some penalties. The failure to post, the failure to register. And then we have some defenses that tenants can bring that gives them civil protections against landlords who do bring unlawful actions against them. We also have a misdemeanor portion of that ordinance. Now, all of this was in place prior to COVID. COVID changed everything. The federal response to COVID came through an order from the CDC, which expires on January 31st of this year. It applies to all residential property, but is specific to areas where states and local governments have not acted. So if no other things apply to you, this will apply. The California response, after a series of executive orders by Governor Newsom, was to pass 3088. 3088 essentially took effect on September 1st at the expiration of Governor Newsom's orders and will run currently through January 31st, 2021, although there is some discussion about extending that. It offered a lot of protections and is very detailed. One of the big takeaways on the next slide you'll see is that these just cause protections are extended to all residential units. The demolition provisions under the just cause section were narrowed down. They have to prove that they were necessary. And even bigger than that is on the next slide, you'll see that they have actually divided time into two different periods. And these two periods govern how rent can be collected from landlords. In addition to all of this, our city made a number of proclamations. And we have one in March and then two following in April. We've halted all evictions for non-payment of rent. In addition, we've taken some action to protect commercial tenants, but we did put some burden on the tenants to produce documents for their landlord, so this is not all just taken on good faith. On the next slide, you'll see what's basically a summary of the COVID responses. It has the federal responses listed out, the big takeaways, the California big takeaways, and the local takeaways. There are a number of issues and interplay between these, but these are the big major points of all of them. And finally, on the last slide, you'll see is the order of laws to apply. This is sort of a walkthrough for any piece of property. The first question to ask would be, do the local regulations apply? Followed by 3088, followed by the CDC order. Then you get to our regular laws, which is the ordinance, AB 1482, and then finally the Housing Act. So I hope that provided you with some background. I know that there's a lot more information contained in the slides, and if you have any questions, I'm available to answer them. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Do any of the council members or city staff have any questions?
Mr. Mayor, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. It's Councilmember Hernandez. I know you're on telephone today, so not a problem. Just one of my major concerns, and perhaps two things actually. Can you describe what debt collection is, or debt? You had something where it becomes debt collection.
Yes, that is under the 3088. So when the state divided everything into those two categories, what it did was it created some protections for rent that had not been paid. So the back due rent from March 1st to August 31st of 2020, landlords can't go and just harass their tenants to collect it. They actually have to go and file a lawsuit to collect that debt. It's a small claims lawsuit that they actually have to file. They have to get a judgment after proving their case up, and then they can then enforce and go after that rent. Sort of a procedural protection for tenants and a way to avoid massive evictions. The other is the other time period, which is started in September 1st and runs through the end of January. And as long as tenants have been paying 25% of their rent, the same protections that applied from March to August will apply also to September through January, meaning that the unpaid debt becomes, the unpaid rent becomes this consumer debt that needs to be collected as part of a separate lawsuit outside of eviction, and comes with all of the protections that consumer debt would against harassment and things like that.
Thank you. And just for clarification, when you say consumer debt, is that could that be? Could a landlord take their tenants and essentially get to the point where their wages are garnered in the future? Because that's my biggest concern is not necessarily now, but I'm worried about 6 months from now or a year from now, where, unfortunately, for whatever reason, they've, the landlords have, filed this information, and tenants perhaps may or may not look at wage garnishment. Does that fall under debt, consumer debt, or no?
So it's a bit of a nuanced question, and I can give you more information at the next meeting. But with any consumer debt, the potential for wage garnishment is there. That is one of the potential remedies that the landlord could seek. It's not the immediate remedy, but—
And Council Member Hernandez, how that usually works is if there is a judgment and they go through that process and get a judgment, then they can go about that garnishment process. But they do have to have that judgment first.
Understood. And this is, more of a statement than a question, and something for the council to discuss, perhaps at a later meeting. This is a concern that I have. Obviously, I think it's a concern of, all my colleagues on the phone. But, one of the things that I can see is this being a black mark on future tenants when they're looking to, rent additional homes or apartment units or whatever the case may be. I'd really like for us to discuss at a later point where, if somebody has had this type of consumer debt, that should not be held against them as a way to not rent, commercial and or, residential or habitual home or dwelling. Thank you.
And Mr. Hernandez, if I may,
Yes,
really
please.
briefly, there is a provision in 3088 which states that this consumer debt cannot be reported on a tenant's credit report. So that protection is in place.
Perfect. Does that apply for commercial tenants or just residential?
It would just be residential.
Okay. I mean, we have a lot of mom and pop organizations in our city, so I'd really like to offer that protection also for them in the future if we can, as a bigger discussion for us. Thank you.
Great. Do any other council members have any questions or concerns regarding housing?
Ben, I'm sorry, I'm going to just take this moment once again, Mr. Mayor, if that's okay.
Yes, go ahead, council member.
Thank you. Ben, can we just make sure that our residents are aware of, what's happening with AB 3088, considering I'm not sure if our new president did extend the federal protection as of today. That was one of the items that was being discussed. And more importantly, if, and I do suspect that AB 3088 will be extended further, considering that we're still in this pandemic, that we're very aggressive in our outreach and on our social media. So residents, both commercial and residential, have this information and know the process. And more importantly, have staff be prepared to answer these type of questions and walk them through so they can have this protection moving forward. Please, thank you.
Yes, we will. We're following that. We're following the news closely, and we'll be reporting out that information as soon as it's made available.
Mayor?
Great. Yes, go ahead, Mayor Pro Tem Avila.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that, Mr. Hernandez, because President Biden did say he was going to extend the eviction moratorium. So I'm waiting to see what that looks like. And I'm sure as soon as we have that information, Ben, you will be able to provide more to us. It's just new, only a few hours old that he announced it. So I'm looking forward to hearing. Hopefully it's a good one and not just a Band-Aid to the problem that we have right now.
Yeah, and by all means, I think these are all great questions. And then of course, we have to make the effort to make sure that we do our part to channel this information to our residents, right? Because they're the ones that need to be aware of these regulations and things that help them most. And so if no other council member or city staff has any more comments regarding this topic, I believe we can move on to our closed session.
Okay, so yeah, if there's nothing else, then the applicable council and staff would need to sign into the closed session.